So something a little bit different for this video. It's a long one, it's 45 minutes, but it's actually the segment that I did at this year's Vertex 2022 conference. And the subject I was asked to talk about was mobile sculpting. So this video is my kind of response to who is using mobile sculpting, and it gives you some indication of who I think has come to mobile sculpting and why they've come to it. So what I'd like to do during the video and after the video is if you could drop in the comments how you came to mobile sculpting, whether it's Forger or Nomad or any of the other ones, even things like Gravity Sketch on the iPad. I'd love to know, are you a complete beginner, or are you a veteran that uses it as well as ZBrush, and how you came to be using it. So drop those comments down below and take a listen at my presentation for Vertex 2022. So who exactly is going to be using mobile sculpting like Nomad Sculpt and Forger app? Well, in case you didn't know, digital sculpting, it's a type of 3D modeling. I'm sure a lot of you know that. Rather than manipulating points and edges and polygon faces like you would with more traditional box modeling, the artist usually uses a graphic tablet like a Wacom, a stylus, and then they pull, push, scrape, flatten, add clay, remove clay, and all the things a traditional sculptor would be able to do. The digital clay space is dominated by ZBrush, which has been around since the late 1990s. I think I've used it since '99, which is well over 22 years now. And ZBrush was quickly followed by Mudbox, 3D Co, and then a few more dedicated programs, and obviously Blender now. And that led to fully fledged animation modeling packages getting some of those sculpting features. So you'll see it in programs like Modo, Cinema 4D, Blender, obviously, and Maya now since 2016. So they all have these digital sculpting tools built in. Now, with the advent of the iPad, we got a lot of 2D programs like Procreate and obviously now Photoshop on the iPad. But apps have come along that have allowed us to do things that we normally do on a PC or a Mac, as you would see in things like ZBrush. Forger on the iPad's been around for over 10 years now, so it's not exactly a new phenomenon, and that's recently been purchased by Maxon. So they obviously see a need for a sculpting program on a mobile device, and then they followed that up with the purchase of ZBrush as well. So they obviously know how important sculpting is to their future. Nomad Sculpt entered the market with a big bang in 2020, and it quickly established dominance as the developer likes to push out updates at an accelerated rate, which is fantastic. New creation tools spring up all the time really, but there aren't many 3D modeling solutions on a mobile device like an iPad. That could be for a number of reasons, but obviously the limitations of the hardware is the main stumbling block. And in the last couple of years, Apple's really improved their chipsets, and it's increased the amount of physical memory that they have on an iPad, and it's becoming less of an issue now. And of course, we now have the M1, which, as anyone knows who's done any research into this, it's such a powerful chip for a mobile device. The M1 is what you'd see, and there is obviously an M1 Mac version or MacBook Pro, so it's a chip that they're going to put a lot of effort into developing over the years. I've been using and promoting both of those apps for about, a couple of years now really, and I started to wonder who the apps are actually aimed at and who it's actually going to be the people that are using them. And I've come to a couple of conclusions really, and there's two main groups. So the first group, generally speaking, are people who've never really tried 3D or have tried it and found it difficult using what they feel are overly complex programs. When you've been modeling for years, it's very, very easy to forget how daunting it can be when you first start to 3D model or sculpt and use 3D sculpting programs. Trying to explain things like voxel remesh, dynamesh, dyntopo, vertex painting, dynamic tessellation to someone who isn't a 3D artist, and they just look at you as if you're speaking some kind of an alien language, and the jargon is completely all around us in the 3D world and in VFX as a whole. Mobile sculpting, while it's not got all of the technical tools that we want, so we're only now getting retopology and UVing, unwrapping and projection tools, it does allow someone to dive right in, literally dive straight in and create something quite spectacular with very, very little knowledge and very little prior artistic skill even. The second largest group seems to be comprised of people who are already used to digital sculpting programs like ZBrush and Blender, and they want a solution where they can work away from the confines of a desk-bound program, but also any work that they create can be used in their favorite host program. So if you make it on your iPad, you can use it in Blender or ZBrush or Maya, and that's crucial for these people. I'm one of these people, if I'm honest. It's a very different group than the first one, and these are artists that are going to be familiar with the tools, they're going to be familiar with the workflows and techniques, and simply want a convenient way to do what they do every day, but with more flexibility. And there's also some really good analogies in VR creation tools where programs like Gravity Sketch, which started on the iPad, now allow the creator to begin on the iPad or a Wacom tablet and then jump into VR as needed. Being able to cross multiple devices in different ways can improve productivity and motivation for most artists. Obviously, sculpting on a device like an iPad comes with some limitations, and those limitations can include things like you got an Apple Pencil, but it's got no buttons, so other secondary tool features and ways to interact are more difficult, so you have to use your hands on the screen more. Not all devices have enough memory allocation. The lack of technical features like UVing and the ability to bake out your maps, and of course retopology, which we now might be seeing with something like a Cozy Blanket coming to the iPad. There's not many on the iPad yet other than the sculpting, but it's on the way now, and especially with these newer, faster chips. I generally hear more complaints from the former group than from the latter group. Someone whose only tool is an iPad sculpting app may think it's possible to do an end-to-end process and then be frustrated with the missing parts of the pipeline. The latter group, however, so people who do this for a living, are usually more forgiving as they know they can continue with their technical work once back on their desktop. And again, that's me, so I know where to begin and start because I do it every day with ZBrush and Cinema and all the other programs I use. The iPad is a support tool for me. This is an incredible space to watch really as it develops, and along with things like VR, it's one of the creative spark bases that really has become at the forefront as hardware catches up to the software. I, of course, simplified the groups, and there are more scenarios where artists from more diverse backgrounds may be utilizing the tools, including people with backgrounds like jewelry and prop making and dentistry and fashion, toy creators, and many, many more. And obviously a lot of 2D illustrators and concept artists who need a bit of 3D can find the jump much, much easier with something like Nomad Sculpt on the iPad. As the hardware continues to accelerate and CPU and GPU power becomes more abundant in the smaller mobile devices, this sector is going to see a boom. There's no doubt about it. It's already happening, and so many people are either adding a mobile sculpting option to their workflow or their pipeline, or people are beginning their creative journeys with sculpting on a mobile device, which is absolutely amazing. So the next part of this session is going to be looking at a project that I did, which was it's called a T-Rex course all about Nomad. And the reason that I created it wasn't so much that it was about a T-Rex at all. It was more about a process of using mobile sculpting for creature design. So it's very, very similar to a lot of programs as we've already discussed. So a lot of things you can do in Blender and ZBrush, but obviously you're on your iPad. So what you're seeing on screen at the moment, obviously I'm using reference images, which is a very normal way of guiding the thing that you're going to make. So you can just bring in any image that you want, whether it's one that you've drawn yourself or modeled yourself, and then bring it in as a background reference. Now you haven't got a quad view like you have with programs like Blender. It's much more like ZBrush in that regard. So you can have a side or a top profile by turning perspective off and snapping, but there isn't a way to do the quad view. So any images will go in. So as with any project, start with building a reference board. So that this is obviously Pinterest, and I'm doing my reference here as I would for any project. So just looking at what other people have done, getting inspiration. Obviously not copying or plagiarizing anyone, but just being aware of the learning anatomy from reference. And it might be that you want some of this reference in the scene, and it might be that you want some of the reference in a program like maybe VisRef, which you can have over the top, and obviously Procreate, you can put your references over the top now, as you're working. So references are a good starting place. Now, this is about creation or refinement, and this is just a method I've taught over the years, where you must understand whether you're in creation or refinement with every sculpt that you do. And the reason I talk about this is that when you're in creation, you're building the initial block out, you're doing all the primary forms, and you're chopping and changing and affecting the model however you want, without any thought of topology or any of the worrying, the more heavy technical terms or things that you're going to do. And that all comes in refinement. And the reason we do one and then change to the other is that when you're in creation, you can do all kinds of things. As soon as you're in refinement, then it's a little bit more, you've got to be careful. So creation is for blocking out. It's for adding and subtracting, so it's the time when we might say, right, we need extra claws, extra fingers, extra toes, we need horns, we need spikes, we might need an extra limb, something like that. You can use tools like trim and split, and you can even switch something on called dynamic tessellation, so it's giving you more topology where you need it, the same as Sculptris Pro in ZBrush. You can voxel remesh, which means you can apply a new flow to your mesh overall. It's very rough, but it basically brings the polygons down. You can merge your primitives and use voxel remesh to do that as well. And that means you can bring all these primitives together. And I'll show how that worked with this particular project in a few minutes. Merging primitives and voxel remesh is one of the big things that you must learn when you're just starting to learn this stuff. This is presuming here your creature is fully designed already. You'd only be using reference if you've got a creature that's pre-designed and you're just working to that layout. If you're just free-forming, then you wouldn't need to think about the same sort of things. But what you do need to do is make sure that the scale is correct, and all of your the length of the limbs is correct, and make sure that the tail is the right length and the nose is the right length as much as possible. Once that's done and you're out of creation, that's when you've got to kind of stop the boat, really. You've got to define a low poly, nicer geometry. Now, you could send that out to something like ZBrush or Instant Meshes or Blender and just create yourself a low poly mesh, or retopologize it in any program that supports it. But in the iPad, it's quite limited at this current time. Now, in this particular project, I do remesh it. I do literally start with a low poly mesh that I've made inside of Nomad, but you don't have to do that. You can easily go outside and bring it in from another program. It would be great if we had something like ZRemesher or the ability to retop, but we don't just yet. So as you're in refinement, you must stop voxel remeshing, because each time you do that, if you've got a multi-resolution model, the minute you voxel remesh, you're going to lose that, and you'd have to find a way of projecting that back on, which again is not simple in Nomad. So refinement is about the detail, and you're only going to be able to subdivide it up. So if your base model's 20,000 polygons, and then you want to be timesing that by 4 because you're going to subdivide it, and obviously that's up to 80,000, and then obviously it goes up to 320 and then onwards and onwards. So what you don't want to do is be at 320 and then remesh it and then lose all of that subdivision capability of being able to go back down, which is crucial for when we get to posing. So here's just a little line of all the stages that I go through when I'm working on a project like this. So primary shapes, primary forms is the first one, and we will do like 5 or 10 minutes of this after this little bit of the video. But at the moment, what you're seeing on screen there is a set of primitives that have been brought together. So spheres, cylinders, cubes, whatever it takes in a layout that describes your shape. And the idea here is never, don't worry about them not fitting together or, bits in the middle or anything like that. It's about the fact that you've got a shape that describes the thing that you're going to build. And this is a great thing to get good at, really, is not worry in any way about your detail and just worry about your primary forms. So it's a way to think about shape language, as in you're thinking about what kind of shapes and poses am I going to have, even at this stage. How will the body sit on the ground? How do those feet, sit on the ground? Is it plantigrade or dichidigrade? Like this one is. Plantigrade is us humans, and dichidigrade is anything that stands up on its toes. So like a dog, horse, werewolf, you name it. And obviously a T-Rex and any of these bipedal dinosaurs are in that category. So once you've got that defined, here I've just flooded it with one colour now instead of having those colours, and I'm literally just bringing them all together with a voxel merge, and that just mashes them all together and gives you a new level of topology. So remember the rules that I said, which is at this stage you can do anything you want. So you're remeshing whenever you want, you're chopping bits off if you need to, you're adding bits, you're adding other primitives. It's anything goes at this stage because you're still just looking at the primary forms. So now I'm using things like the smooth brush, the clay brush, and just getting it to look smoother at this point. I made it dark then because I was looking at the silhouette, and we'll look at that a bit later on. So now I'm just thinking about the great big shapes or any surface landmarks that I might want to put in. So things like the shoulder, the cheek, the top of the hip where the pelvis is, a bit more volume around the tail area where there's muscles that support the tail, and a bit more definition around the cheek. But again, you're still in an early stage. You're getting onto tertiary forms, your secondaries now. So you're getting to the point where you've gone beyond the initial block out, and you're starting to add the big muscle groups. So I'm just thinking about volume around the cheeks, thinking about volume around the shoulder blades. All of that starting to come together without getting too detailed. So we're not massively into the details of the fingers yet, or the claws, or the talons, whatever you want to call it. And it's still not completely right with, the width of the jaw isn't quite right. There's still quite a lot wrong at this stage. But this is what this early stage is for. Once you've gone through that stage, then you can start moving into more detail. So you can see there that the toes and the talons are much more defined now. So that's just a case of going through, using things like the crease tool, which is like damn standard in ZBrush, and you can just define exactly what it is that you're building in terms of detail. So we'll keep working away at all of these, like any of the larger groups. And then straight on to the have a look at the surface detail on this one. You can see we just started to put some of the surface detail with alphas. So these are where you make your own artwork and use it as an alpha brush, exactly the same as a lot of other programs. And you can make them either in Nomad or in Procreate and just do black and white images, and they basically become what you use as, they call them stamps in here. So I broke the symmetry there. I don't often do that at this point, but I just thought at this stage it was good to show that the amount of life that comes into a creature, and that's showing it with the wireframe on. It shows it's quite a mess underneath. There's no thought to underlying topology yet or anything like that. So it's just all about the shape. And then the final one, there's a bit of a paint job on it, and obviously now it's getting into really heavily these really are your tertiary details. These are the details, and even to the point now where I've just thought I'd show there that there are layers in Nomad as well, so you can actually paint on separate layers and blend those in. So it doesn't have anywhere near the capability of something like Substance Painter or Designer, and this is only working on Vertex groups and Vertex colors. But it is useful, super useful, and especially because you can export that out. And take the color, and you could use that in other programs. So it is a really useful way of doing things. So onto the next section. So we'll look at a primitive block out. So we've already just talked about it in the previous section. And this is how I generally do most of my blockouts, really, is just with primitives. So whether it be in ZBrush or even in VR these days, that quite often I will block things out with primitives. And what you're basically doing is giving yourself a set of shapes, so spheres, cylinders, cubes, whatever it is that you feel that you need to describe the shape that you're trying to sculpt on. And what we do is we bring them all into the scene, put them all together to the shape that we want using the reference in the background, and then we voxel merge them all together as we've already showed. So I started here at the head end. Quite often I might start at something like the hips or the central part of the character or creature, but starting at the head when you know exactly what you're working on makes no difference. So remember, there's no quad view, so I've got all them images in the background because you can't switch between them without reloading the one that you want. You can't just go from a front view to a top view, which would be nice, especially if you have lots of different reference imagery loaded in. Using the trim tool there, so I just trimmed off the shape of the jaw, just to give me that nice tapered shape that we want. And that is a very powerful tool. It works really, really well in Nomad, and don't forget you've got like lasso and rectangle and all sorts of different ways to implement that tool. So that's the jaw done and defined, and now it's time to move down the neck. So again, a cylinder again. Don't keep going and calling new primitives, just duplicate ones that you've got in the stack. Now, some people would name each part of this, but there's absolutely no point, because the point of these primitive blockouts is that they're all going to be put together into one mesh, and they're going to be merged with voxel remesh. So there isn't actually even a great amount of point to having the individual colors that you can see there. Now, in other programs, that is quite pertinent. So they can be described as polygroups in ZBrush, and it's the same in ZBrush. In Blender to some degree. But that would make you vertex sets in other programs and sets that you can work on. But in Nomad, the color is nothing more than that. It's color, and when we remesh, the colors will still be there, but they'll blend into each other. So it really is just a habit of mine rather than a necessity. So remember, I've got perspective off most of the time, and got and being able to snap it as well most of the time allows you to really get this shape defined quite accurately. Try and make sure that the shapes are larger than the ones that they're going to be at the end, because you're going to use things like flatten and crease, and you're going to indent into the surface and bring it smaller. So it's more like carving a piece of wood than adding clay, because what you're doing is you're making the big rough shape, and then you're going to use the equivalent of like a chisel and sandpaper to refine it down to the shape that you want. Now there I use for the tail, there's lots of ways we can, there's a tube tool even that we could have used, but I chose just to use just a cube that I extended out to a rectangle and then trimmed it off. And then that trim tool allows me to do great big sweeping cuts that gets me to the right volume very, very quickly. And with symmetry on, it means you're doing both sides quite easily. I've chamfered the edges at the top there to round it off a little bit, but it won't be anywhere near as close as I need it to be, so that I'll do that bit later on. But you can see there I'm splitting the tail into 3 parts, and that means I can scale each part independently, and you can see I'm doing it there. So make that bit straight after the hip, and it's got much more muscle in it. There is a step there behind it, so I would probably want to remove that at some point. You can see it at the back of the green shape. So next, I want to work on the shoulder. So the shoulder is obviously what holds the arm, and the shoulder, the rotator is just off the shoulder blade, is quite an important landmark because it sticks out. It's quite bony and it carries a lot of muscles on a lot of creatures. Oddly, with the T-Rex, it's got those tiny little front arms. And again, this particular one that I've built is not very accurate. It is based on quite a few different dinosaurs, not just a T-Rex. So it would have smaller arms than this. So there's a cube for the hands, So you can just define the shape of the hand as a cube and then drop the fingers off that. That looks quite convincing once you know, especially because you've turned it in. And there's a thing called pronation and supination with hands. So if your hands are dangling down, that's called pronation. If you have them up, pointing to the sky, or palms up, that's supination. So the hands are pronated and slightly turned in as well. You'll see that on things like kangaroos and, you know, even on humans, obviously. So that's the arms defined quite easily. So let's move on to the thigh here. So a great big sphere, and we'll use a sphere quite a few times in the leg because the calf muscle below this is the same. We'll just duplicate this same model. So just literally get the scale right, get it to roughly the right sort of position, and then duplicate it and do the next one. And with no more thought than that, this primary building up of the block out is very, very fast. You know, I'm always looking at references, as you can see there, because I should always be making sure that even though the reference is in the background, it's good to look at other creatures of this type. So anything that's quadruped, and certainly Dachydigrade, if it's up on its toes like this, then it's, you know, it's something that you can reference. You can see there I've turned the leg out a little bit, the lower part, which is actually the foot, so it comes up off the calf. That's the calf that I'm doing now, or calcaneus it's called, down into what is the first part of the toes, the foot, sorry, and then into the toes. And now the toes are actually cubes. So I was going to carry on with cylinders, but I wanted something that would be flat on the floor. So a cube is already flat on one side, and we'll just round off the other two. So it's better than a cylinder, because with a cylinder you'd be chipping off the bottom to make it flat or flattening it. So it's much nicer to start with something with a flat bottom. So that's definitely helpful. So time to remesh now. So I've literally just called a voxel remesh, and you can see it's basically putting it all together in one mesh like so, and the colors are still there, but the model is now all merged into one. So I've done it again there, and those colors we can just get rid of those at any point. And now from this point now you're still in primary forms, you're still doing primary forms. There you can see me flooding the color. But you know, the bit that you're up to now is sculpting. So this isn't now, it's going to be the clay brush, it's going to be the crease tool, the flatten, as you can see there, and you're now refining it a little bit better. So you're not putting surface detail in yet, you're not looking for any scales or anything like that. What you're trying to do now is just do the next part of just getting all the volume right. So you know where that tail's got a little bit of a dint in it, that needs to be filled in with sculpting and smoothed over before you ever think about moving it to the next stage, really. So that cylinder made the shoulder look quite good. And did you notice probably there that the chest is still looking like a cylinder with a bit of a smooth, bit of a flatten, and a bit of a clay brush? That can really just suddenly look like a chest. So it doesn't take much to start making this look quite realistic. And the thigh, with hardly any work, has started to feel like a thigh. It's got that, you know, a bit of the muscle definition that we'd want, just by the fact that it is the shape that it is. We haven't actually defined the muscle yet. So reference to crocodile here for the side of the mouth. So if you look at any of these big reptiles, they've got the muscle that pulls their jaw up is on the inside, and it's the same with modern day reptiles like a crocodile and a snake, and virtually all reptiles. You can see that little bit of skin at the inner side of the corner of the mouth, and that really defines the look of a reptile. So a dinosaur would be in that category, and you're a little bit different on birds, obviously, but you know, it gives you an idea of the kind of family that you're in there. So we're almost at the stage now where we can move on to truly onto the secondary forms. So we're actually, realistically, we're into secondary forms now, because we're doing using the crease tool now. I'm literally defining things on the surface that I want to sculpt. So I'm almost drawing on the surface by saying, right, I want to do some ribs there, I want some creases here, I want some muscle definition here. Quick check with silhouette. So no harm in turning it black for a minute just to have a look at what it looks like and see if it reads well, you know, as a character, as a creature at this point. So do that as much as you dare. So, you know, do turn it black as much as you can to get a look at whether it's working and whether you need to do any corrective surgery before you go on to this part. Now this part is where you make a low poly. You can send it out, you can go and do it in Blender, you can go and do it in Instant Meshes, you can go and do it in any program that supports retop or auto retop like Z Remesher in ZBrush. And if you don't want to do that, you do what I do here, which is I just made a relatively low poly, not good geometry, not good for animation or anything like that. But you've got a low poly version that you can go back down to at any point, and that's the point really, because to be able to pose it later, you want to be able to access that lower poly model. And now it's time to go really heavy with the secondary form. So we're flattening off the brush, which means we make it really flat across the top, exactly the same as we would in ZBrush, with the focal shift being low. And it would make a nice brush for our muscles. So again, referencing, you know, going in, like, where do I need muscles coming off the back of those thighs? How many muscles are in the tail? What muscles go up to the back? You know, that bit that I'm doing there now is called the iliac crest, and it's where the top of the hips are protruding. You can see that in cattle a lot, and you can see it in horses a little bit. You can see how the leg goes into a hip assembly or a hip joint, and it's very important for dinosaurs because it's quite often how they're defined, because there's different types of groups of dinosaurs with avians and non-avian hips and things like that you can learn about. And I'm now doing muscle definition, so I'm definitely into secondary forms, getting close towards getting ready to do details. And I've subdivided it, so I've gone up a resolution that I can go back down. Done the feet, did them off camera actually, so that they were done earlier, but not on not something that I've shown you. So that's the same process, just a bit more detail on there. You can see the shape of the polygons there. It's not the best. But that, we keep saying there are compromises you have to make with mobile sculpting, simply because the technology's not got everything that you'd want. And now if you're coming to this new and you've never done anything, then it won't mean a lot to you. But if you're coming the other way, if you're one of the group that are, people who are coming from Maya and ZBrush and industry tools, you'll appreciate those kind of comments a lot more, because you'll be looking for specific tools. And there are certainly still some tools missing, so there's still things that we want a lot of that we haven't got, but I suppose that's just greedy, isn't it? So we've got such an amazing tool already. So smaller brushes now to get some of this detail going, and we're really thinking about like the underside and all of the shapes that define like the hanging, sagging flesh, and where the belly would hang down, where the chest would hang down. What extra detail do I need to put even under there? So even though it is hidden away, a lot of this, it does add to the silhouette. So if you get it wrong at this point, you have it reading incorrectly from different angles. So time to have a look at those horrible hands. So at this point, it's a case of making some kind of demarcation between the talon or the nail or the claw and the actual fingers. So a good thing you can do is you can just isolate. So using masking and then hiding things that are masked, you can then just do like work on a portion of it, and that's great. That's superb for being able to hide a bit of the mesh to give the system a bit of a chance to just be focusing on those polygons that are visible, and two, it helps to hide things so you're not sculpting on something in the background when you think you're just sculpting on the fingers. So taking an opportunity just to work all around the shoulder, going down the back of the arm, the triceps. It's not a huge part of a T-Rex. The arm is such a small little thing, but it can really break the reality if you don't get this bit right. So just work on the muscles, make it looks very humanoid actually, this one. Thinner wrists, fatter forearm, and then a shoulder, like an elbow joint. So a little bit of I'm using the crease tool there just to define some of the areas, and obviously the creases on the underside, where the skin folds. So that instantly made it look a bit more realistic. And then just move on to the next part. So big muscle groups on the neck, underneath the chin. You can have some flabby flesh under there, as well as the muscles. Don't forget the skin. You've got different layers to consider. So we are so used to just talking about muscles. We don't probably talk enough about the fatty layers, and all of the things that make up the entire creature, from bone all the way up to this, the surface and the skin on the top. So a little bit of detail now. So we might as well say we're now in the tertiary, the final detail. So we're actually thinking about surface detail now. So I'm using that was basically the crease tool but inverted. So that gives me like a nice thing to do veins with, and anything you want raised up off the surface. And then crease tool the other way is just like gouging in and just defining that, the mouth area a little bit more. Obviously with models like this, the eyeball would be separate, the tongue would be separate, the teeth would be separate. But this is all about the surface of the one primary model, which is the surface of the body. So spending a bit of time here, it looked like a hippo then, I noticed, but basically the front end hadn't been defined. So we're starting the sculpting, and now we're looking at really thinking about the shape of the snout and the shape of the lower jaw, and just really bring it to life now. But by like moving it around, and you don't need to do anything that would change it in terms of I'm not voxel remeshing or anything like that. All we're doing is moving around what we've got, because once you're in this kind of refinement phase, you've already locked that down, as I've said multiple times now. So I've brought some teeth in there, just very much just a spike and an eyeball, and they're just made in exactly the same way with a primitive, and just duplicate them and position them. And the thing is, it suddenly starts to pop the minute you bring those others in, because it starts to feel like it's a bit more realistic now, because it's got that tongue, which was just a sphere actually. That can make it suddenly look like a whole different creature if you get that wrong. So spend some time with that, and remember to keep looking at your reference off the screen, because if you've noticed, we aren't using reference in the background now because we're just doing surfacing. So at this point I would have been looking at books, I would have been looking at images on the other screen to make sure that I've got, if I'm working on the shoulder, then I'll pull up a reference of a shoulder. Same if I'm working on a tail, I might be looking at what muscles drive a tail. And it doesn't have to be a T-Rex. You can use other ones, other models as reference. Get that big scapula worked out. That's a big piece of bone inside that really makes a surface mark that you need to think about. Belly needs to be a bit more volume there, so you can see me pulling it down and making it a bit wider, just to fill that to make it feel like it's got weight underneath. And that's one of the big things you should always be looking at is does this creature look like it's convincingly being affected by gravity? So is gravity pulling it down in the right places? Bit of surface detail there on the feet. So I'm actually drawing scale detail here now, so we are definitely coming into the closing stages. And again, you can use a number of things. So the crease tool is a great start, but then you can start thinking about using stamps and your own basically your own images as alphas, which will come at a later stage. And those alphas can be used both for sculpting and for painting. So it can be used to really define the surface in a number of ways. So working down the tail now, you notice in this model I haven't broken the symmetry. So in that earlier section I was exploring things by moving the tail, but that could be on a layer, and that could be turned off for the duration of the sculpting. So keep any of your explorations of poses on a separate layer completely, so that they don't affect what your base sculpt looks like, and you'll thank yourself for that when you get it into other programs, because the more T-posed it is, the better it is for rigging, and the better it is for for lots of things down the line. So moving look how erratic the tail volume is there, so you can see me working down it, trying to get it like linear, from fat to thin right down at the end. And I'm not doing any one particular area over and over again. I'm moving around all the different parts of the body until if I find a bit, I'll work on it. I can see there the calf just doesn't look good, so I'm sculpting either flattening or adding the clay to bring that calf volume correct. So that's solved that area quite quickly with just those few tools. And then onto things like the underside of the belly with more sagging flesh, really, as it droops down to the side of the T-Rex. So we're pretty much done there now, and then we would add, with alphas, we would add quite a lot more detail with those. This next section is it's about posing, but what I did was I just wanted to show the basics of posing using masking. So I just used a very simple primitive shape again, just to make it clear what it is that you do. So when you want to pose, you mask off an area, you blur that area so it blurs between it, and then with the gizmo, as you bend, because there's a blur or a blend, you get a nice bend. You can see it really clearly there. If you go too far, it definitely changes the volume too much. So you have to move the pivot point a little bit to make sure that it pivots in a way that a realistic bone would. But that is how posing occurs in Nomad. There is no pose tool as there is in many other tools. Like Blender's got a great pose tool while you're sculpting. So you have to have a low poly, because if you have a high poly and you try and do it, it won't blend across, and that means you get a harsh bend, and that isn't what you need. That's not going to help you with that feature at all. So having the high poly and the low poly is exactly how we do it. And here's our model as it stands with a paint job. So we did a very quick paint job, and this particular one is a very cartoony kind of style. So I went for a stomping T-Rex. So the one that we made it from quite realistic to this cartoony effect quite simply. Now, because I've got the low res, I'm going back down to the low res, and using that technique I've just shown you with the masking, you can then just move it around as simply like a toy, really. It's articulating it by protecting the areas you don't want to move and having the other areas available. That's pretty much how it works, and you can see there how quick it is. I know it's speeded up, but it really does not take long at all to do it. So just moving the eyes into place and the teeth into place for the pose version, then added just a very simple ground and some lighting, and that's pretty much how we would handle the posing. So from that stage, there's so many things you could do. You could take it out to 3D print, you could take it out to Photoshop or whatever you want. You could, it's a real-time render, so you're going to have to almost essentially screen print it. You're exporting the image once you've lit it correctly. And from there, you can then take those images into those other programs and start working them up into a full image. So we'll have a quick look at it in Procreate, which we'll keep it on the iPad for a second. So we'll just bring those images that I've just made into Procreate here. Again, it doesn't matter what you use. I mean, I'm using that's a technique where you make it black and you use a mask. But at the moment, that's because I'm just doing a different background on there. But it depends how you render it in Nomad as to whether you can do that or not. If you've got a background, you won't be able to do that. And now what I'm doing is I'm using several layers that I've just rendered out from Nomad, and I'm just combining them all, thinking about color theory. So if it's very red on the model, I'm going to use a more bluish background. So I'm going to go with colors across the color wheel. and basically I'm just playing with the the different layers of different lighting. So I'm not affecting any lighting as such. I'm using a light from another render that I did of the same scene. So I basically moved the light around in the scene, and you can see there's bits that I want and bits that I don't want. So I'm looking at like putting one layer over the top, changing the blend mode, changing the opacity, and working out what it is I want from each of those layers until I've got them all comped together nicely. And that's pretty much how you would do it in Photoshop or as you can see here, Procreate. I like to keep it on the iPad as much as I can, simply because it's, especially while I was learning all of this on the iPad. And Procreate is a program I've probably used for about 8 years now, something like that, and it really has affected. It really has stopped me using Photoshop because it's so convenient, and I'm keeping it all there on the iPad. Which is just quite nice, quite liberating. So I hope you've enjoyed my little look over how I'd make a T-Rex on an iPad. And if you want to have a go at anything like that, then head over to SouthernGFX on YouTube, and you can find links to all my courses and anything that I create. Obviously there's hundreds and hundreds of videos on YouTube there, so I'd appreciate you taking a quick look at that and subscribing if you feel that you can. And I hope you have a lovely Vertex this year.